1517fund.com. That's 1517fund.com /take-action. We would love to chat with you, especially if you took your Friday evening to sit down and learn about some math theory with us. So with that, I would love to introduce our speaker this evening. Mathew Crawford has been teaching mathematics to peers, adults, and children since the age of 5. After helping his school in Alabama and Alabama State math teams win numerous national math team titles, he spent some time working as a statistician and then a quant trader for various hedge funds, including D.E. Shaw & Co. and the Susquehanna International Group. Mathew made a planned exit from finance in 2003 to start an education company with a Wall Street co-worker called Art of Problem Solving. That has served over 500,000 students studying a broader and more advanced mathematical curriculum. He has since built numerous education companies and schools and is in the process of trying to engineer something new yet again. So Mathew, thank you for joining us this evening. I know that we are looking forward to learning more about mathematics with you.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. First, I just want to make sure, does everybody hear me? We all good? Oh, excellent.
Yep. I will, one quick housekeeping note though, excuse me, sorry, Mathew. Yeah. If this is your first time joining us this evening, everybody, we do ask that you keep Q&A until the end. Mathew has worked in sufficient time for question and answer this evening. Feel free to use the chat box if you want to chat with other participants, but primarily for Q&A, we're going to have a Q&A session towards the end of our conversation this evening. So go ahead, Mathew.
Thanks. Well, first I'd like to thank Danielle for inviting me to speak and the entire 1517 Fund team for providing me with a platform to give a talk that I've really wanted to give for a number of years. When Danielle first invited me, she actually told me that she was interested in learning number theory and asked if I could teach a class on number theory. And I declined, and I'll kind of explain why I declined that later on, but asked, she was accommodating when I said, hey, could I just give a talk on math education? But I'm going to try to do some of that number theory teaching in another format. I run an adult math club in which we just started doing some number theory recently. But the next thing I want to say is that the name of this talk was actually the hardest part to put together. I wasn't quite sure what to say to draw people's attention to some way of grouping things that I see that I'm a little bit concerned with, and then I'll get to gradually as we talk. But I want to go ahead and set up the image, which is whether it's Star Trek or any other kind of futuristic science fiction story image, we have this idea that possibly in the future we're going to be learning all the most advanced things that we learn, possibly from cyborgs or artificial intelligence or something like that. And while I think maybe, just maybe that's possible, I think that is actually much further out than I think most people think, including many people in technology. I think that that mathematics is very misunderstood in terms of what's important about it and what would be hard to accomplish on that level. I think that mathematics is much more about art and exploration, which are far more human and dynamically human activities. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. The next thing I want to talk about is to explain a little bit about what I do as a math educator to possibly begin to give you an idea as to what's different. Now, I helped build Art of Problem Solving, and for anybody who might be looking that up at artofproblemsolving.com, there's a giant online forum there with about 500,000 registered users, most of whom first find the place when they're in middle or high school, and they're interested sometimes in contest math, but interested in doing more math than they're getting. They want to learn things more deeply, perhaps on a meta level. They want to learn more about the discrete math that they don't see very much of at all going through school, because we have this ages-old linear path through algebra and geometry and on to calculus that excludes the vast majority of the number theory and the combinatorics. Any probability or statistics that would be required for, which is most of probability and statistics. So we gave them a broader and deeper curriculum, and people enjoyed it, and it grew by word of mouth. And I wrote, while I was there for 3 years, most of the online classes. I taught most of the online classes there, and wrote about 4 of the books, 2 of the textbooks in the textbook series. But then I stepped away from that because I saw a different set of problems that I wanted to tackle. And one thing that I did was I opened 2 schools. The first one that I opened was back where I grew up in the Birmingham, Alabama area. And I said, what we need is to accomplish something that is a cultural feat. And in fact, many of our online students, as much as anybody in the world could come, and we would have, the occasional student from Iowa or Nebraska or something like that, it was still true that a huge proportion of the groupings of our students were from places like New York City, where you had Stuyvesant or Brock Science, or any number of elite middle and high schools there, and of course the Bay Area was just stocked with people interested in mathematics. But what I wanted to do was see, hey, is it true that many more people can learn much more mathematics than they think? How much is it the case that these areas are pulled by people whose parents get them interested because of what they do on a professional level or what interests they have? And so we're going to come back and talk about that a little bit later. I personally have very strong beliefs, and I have some evidence supporting this that says that the number of people who can learn a good deal of mathematics is far, far larger than what we think. And that for the most part, the real separation happens on an interest level. But when I stepped away and I wanted to start something that was different, that was a cultural center, I built my classroom around this idea. I built my classroom around the idea that what we wanted was a community. Anywhere you had a community, suddenly you had much better engagement by the students. And I'll mention that there's research by Dr. Andreescu and Dr. Kane, and I believe a third author whom I don't know, can't remember, but I know the 2 of them. And they researched where it was that girls did the most mathematics. And they studied around the United States. And what they came up with was anywhere you had large clusters like the Bay Area or around DC, places like Silver Spring and Alexandria, or New York City, wherever you had clusters of a lot of people already doing mathematics on a more advanced level in middle and high school, that you had all the successful girls, at least when you studied who was taking the mathematical Olympiads, which are the highest level US competitions. And I can't remember the proportion, like around 500 students a year take these national and junior national math Olympiads. And I can't remember the proportion who are girls, but basically outside of a certain number of communities, there were no girls. And so one of the things that I did was I said, hey, well, let's create a community feel, even though this, Birmingham, Alabama is not one of those places where you get many of those outlier points. And eventually I had 48% enrollment by girls in the program. And while it is that I don't really set out to create that mixture, but I had a theory that community would bring in more students. And in particular, it seems to have happened more on the level of drawing girls into studying mathematics. And I think from those programs in Birmingham, I've had out of 600 students, maybe 400 of whom have graduated. I think I have at least 12 students at MIT, 6 boys and 6 girls. So I want to mention that to brag on the program just a little bit. And then let's talk about the classroom design. One of the things that I did was, it's not just a lecture board in front of the room. What I wanted was for things to be community feeling, for things to be conversational. And so 360 degrees, except the doorways, 360 degrees around the room, it's all whiteboard, just walls from head to toe of whiteboard. And just for anybody who might be interested, if you just go to like Home Depot, you can get 4x8 melamine board, 1/4 inch thick for $13 a board. So when you're thinking, like I built a school that was like a 3,500 square foot school in Plano. And when I did, I used 2,240 square feet of melamine board that cost about $1,000. Not a crazy investment when you're, building these community classrooms, and it trumps almost any technology that I could think of using in a classroom. I don't use, whizzy big boards to like electric, boards to write on or anything like that, just whiteboard markers and those boards. So the next thing I want to point out is what it looks like when I present curriculum. And I don't know if anybody here ever took an art of problem solving class. Oh yeah, out of curiosity, anybody here? Well, one way or another, in our art of problem solving classes, we focused on walking through mathematics using hard problems. And I like that approach in a lot of ways. But one thing that I wanted to do was refocus on the storytelling mission behind mathematics. So during a 2-hour class, I would hold 2-hour classes, even for students as young as like 10, 11 years old. And for the most part, they were engaged the whole time. And I want to talk about how it was that I achieved that engagement and how they were able to learn so much more about mathematics. I treat everything as a story, but I don't stand up and just tell stories for 2 hours. I want them to engage. So I try to create a path into a good story that is maybe a 10-minute or 15-minute conversation. And I just want to share, one good example of this. Actually, here you'll see, I've just got a page right here that's like the first page of like a 200-page number theory curriculum that I created. And, one of the things you could say is, hey, we have a story behind all kinds of different numbers that we study. What are those stories? But really and truly right here, I'm setting up meta thinking about the structures of integers. And, we'll evolve those stories, but those of you who've taken number theory recognize, both prime factorization and what gets called the division algorithm. I call it the division theorem. Long division is an algorithm, but base numbers and algebraic structures, where we get into Diophantine equations and all the clever things that we can do to study integers within. But here's the storytelling aspect. This is a counting problem. Relates a little bit to number theory later on, but it's a counting problem where I just tell a story. Jimmy and Pushkar were two of my students. And they're at the beach and they're drawing symbols in the sand, lists of symbols. And they draw 12 symbols always. But they have one rule, which is squares in pairs. And so, I talk kids through, hey, what are some examples of this? What are some that succeed and what are some that violate the rules? So we either have legal lists of length 12 or illegal lists of length 12. And, students who are in this particular class, this is probably going to be mostly 12, 13, and 14-year-olds, but they've already done things like figured out, there are 2 to the 12th power different ways to plop down 12 symbols, with binary choices. So we get into this, we talk about different strategies, and some of them may want to do casework. They've already learned some about combinations, and you can solve the problem that way. Leads to a cool combinatorial identity. But then we start discussing strategies like starting small, and then maybe ways to build a conjecture. We get 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and some people at that point recognize the Fibonacci sequence. And then we talk about how it is we can demonstrate that that's true, at which point we're talking about recursion. And if you can imagine this conversation unfolding over a period of 15 minutes with students offering ideas the whole way through, they're pretty engaged. In fact, I would tell people I wind up with basically 0 discipline problems. That's not entirely true, but out of 1,000 students, I only ever had to remove 1 from a classroom, from a class. I would hardly ever have any problems because I would meet the students beforehand and we'd work enough problems that they would know that I could go on these adventures with them. We would do one as an interview exercise. And so they'd come to class pretty excited most of the time. And they'd be in a class often with 9 or 10 other students. If there were 12 of them, 9 or 10 students had taken classes with me previously. And so, they could jump into, the conversation that was going on. So yeah, we jump into the actual recursive solution. So we get 12 and 13-year-olds, learning how to set up recursive algebra. And we walk through similar exercises. And I want to point out, this is a 31-page document right here. What this means is that at the end of a 2-hour class, students are walking away with extra problems and complete solutions to each problem. And part of the reason, like I said earlier, I declined to come give a class on number theory because I just want to point out how much time it takes to typeset. This is LaTeX. I use the same mathematical typesetting language that many textbooks are written in, and to create a 31-page document like this is probably on the order of 31 hours. Probably on average, my average class probably has about 16 pages. So if you can imagine, every one of my 2-hour classes, I've spent around 16 hours preparing. And so to put that much intensity into and mapping out every 2-hour class, I can map it out in ways that keep the students excited and that give them plenty to take home and study from when they're done. I can connect it back to topics that we've learned about before, figure-it numbers. Maybe I was working with them with figure-it numbers when they were 9 or 10 years old, or I had another teacher working with them at that age, and they explored figure-it numbers. And now they can think about figure-it numbers in a separate way, which is to think about them recursively and discover new additional properties of them. And then we can get into, at times, more serious, algebraic solutions with these previous topics that they wouldn't have imagined before. But we try to keep everything as meta as possible. We try not to think about things in terms of formulas, but perhaps, more meta identities. We try to think about the tactics in ways that group together as well as possible. I don't tell them to memorize the formula for the area of a circle in a plane. We just talk about the fact that all of these things come from distance between 2 points, which is Pythagorean theorem, just for example. And so we try to get them thinking that way on every level for each part of the curriculum. But during the year, I don't just hold all algebra for a year or all geometry for a year, because to me, that just feels kind of insane. It's asking for boredom. It's asking for people to take too long to learn something. And that's actually one of the big problems with mathematics is if you tell a good story and people engage with something and they just get it, they get it in 20 minutes, then boom, you've done something that could not be done in a school classroom in a week most of the time. And I'll talk about a little of the research that leads us to. So anyway, that's enough of talking about this for now. Perhaps, I've got other examples that we may look at of different things that I do, but I want to get into the actual grit of the discussion. And first thing I want to say is that mathematics is an art and an exploration. And I don't know how many of you have ever come across this essay, but there's a really wonderful essay that I encourage each of you to look up and read that's called A Mathematician's Lament, sometimes called Lockhart's Lament. And basically this is a story of just how insane it is that we teach mathematics in classrooms in the way that we do. We teach it in a way that cripples the human mind. We teach it in a way that cripples curiosity and makes everyone hate it, and then makes everyone fear the people who can wield it well. And I think we actually have a serious problem in constructing more advanced society because we have these sort of weird fear layers baked into it. And so I actually believe that mathematics education is one of the keys to finding ways to, in certain ways, level off certain inequalities in society, but certainly to make society more cohesive. I think that's true of the entire educational process. A next piece I want to point out is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Roger Penrose. And just to seed this could be an entire discussion of its own. But Roger Penrose thinks of the mathematical world as being this other world separate from ours. And I think that that's a pretty good model. And I think that we detach our minds to go explore this world. And part of the reason that we wind up with mathematics being so misunderstood and the educational process being so poor as a result is that because the number of people who do a good job of detaching their mind and going exploring this mental space and then coming back and learning to communicate with other people about it, that number of people has been far too small for far too long. And this is where I think we're going to change the future course, where we're not going to be learning mathematics from robots. We're going to begin, I think it's already begun. I think it began when we founded Art of Problem Solving. And I think that we're gradually helping people understand what to do next, which I think is to create a larger and larger network of people with a pretty high level understanding, at least of elementary mathematics, such that we can, many people can stop and have these conversations. Where would you begin to teach someone about recursion? How would you do it in such a way that they're going to have a pretty good solid introduction within 15 minutes? And when people begin to ask questions, and I'll give this example. When my wife was in graduate school, she's a biochemist. When she was in graduate school, she decided to take the highest level stats class because she wanted to challenge herself. She now does biostatistics work, but she wanted to challenge herself then, and she had not gotten the best math education prior. She went through calculus, but it was kind of a dead end point because she didn't have the complete foundation. So we spent 6 weeks, like 10 hours a week, rebuilding her foundation. And what I found was, well, she couldn't remember how to take a derivative of a polynomial. She couldn't remember how binomial expansion worked. She couldn't remember what combinations were. So we step back, we start over with permutations and combinations, and then rebuild everything. And after about 6 weeks, she was at a point at which, without any more work from me, she got an A in the course. Within, what we need is a network of people that is expanding and expanding and expanding, who are capable of walking through Socratic conversations, finding out what people missed or don't yet know, finding out what they haven't created a meta concept for, and then reaching for the story that we know to bring out and have that conversation. And I believe that if we do, we're going to increase the pace of math education so fast that the technologists will not be keeping up with that for a very, very long time. In fact, I believe that we'll find that artificial intelligence will not be equipped to do much more than just feed us problems at our level. But they're not going to be creating these stories or finding what story needs to be told until they are so advanced that we're pretty much not distinguishing them from human beings anyway. And I don't even know if we'll ever reach that level. Don't know. I'll leave it as an open question. I think our opinions are probably too strong on it. So one of the things, well, maybe I'll come back to this. One of the things that Danielle mentioned to me, actually, when we started talking about, she had a number theory book, wanted to start to learn some more number theory. She mentioned to me something called Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response, ASMR, which if I had heard of it, I didn't remember it well enough to understand, but it's basically, if you get the warm fuzzies from learning something, if your hairs stand up on end or anything like that, then, that's exciting. That's part of what keeps us, moving forward and investigating. And that it's human beings, I think, that are able to create that response with each other. And that if we learn things deeply enough that we can talk through them and explain them in a simple way, then we are much more often causing each other those reactions. And it's that self-motivation, which is part of learning how to learn. And in fact, what I tell people is learning mathematics is almost entirely a meditative process. And I'm going to go back to a definition of meditation to explain what I mean by that. Meditation, and I think this is unfortunate, in the West, very often we call meditation an Eastern concept because we've reached to find a specific form of meditation to bring it into Western culture. But meditare was a Latin word. Meditation is something that developed everywhere that there was human civilization. To meditate simply means to learn, or perhaps even with a connotation of to learn how to learn. We get into different states, and if we can get into that state, we are much more receptive. And if we can drive that state, then we can be autodidactic learners. We can teach ourselves. I think all these things, like a feeling like an autonomous sensory response, if you can create that, watch the stories, find out how well you've told a story such that you see these aha moments and you see people get excited about it. When you see that, that's when you're on the path to teaching well, doing good education. A next little piece of theory, and this is a side, this is part of how it is that we fail in the classroom model that we use, which, I'm going to go right up to the point in saying that our entire educational system is a system of sabotage. And the question is how much of that is actually intentional and how much is not. But, part of my case in point about sabotage is that we have all kinds of research that we could implement into the way we design the classrooms, but simply don't. And I'm going to talk about a few of these things. One of them is distraction research. And this is something I never actually, I almost never find anybody talking about this, even though the effects are profound. But if you do just a little bit of a literature search, you'll find, 5 or 6, very serious studies on how much it is that students affect each other in a classroom. And one student who is a distraction on average reduces the entire classroom's learning outcome by 8%. Now, and there's, especially with boys, in particular with boys, that period, pre-puberty to the end, there's about a 3-year period where boys are just enormously distractive. And there's even research that says that girls are better schooled when they go to all girls schools, and boys are better schooled when they're in classrooms with girls. And I think that only recently did I understand, and this is my own conjecture, but I think it's simply because with more girls in the classroom, boys are less distracted because there are fewer other boys to distract them. And so, but there's always been this prisoner's dilemma as to how it is you go about, do you separate the populations or you combine them, Or do you focus on finding ways to keep children from distracting each other? And I think the biggest answer to that is to actually have, people trained to be expert educators, to the point that that everybody's attention, everybody's aware, everybody's highly attentive. But I personally think that even the model of putting people in a box to begin with is probably just a terrible, terrible thing. And we're going to get to that very shortly. But one more kind of interesting piece of research is Yerkes-Dodson law. And I've told you a little bit about the way that I design my classes. I told you, hey, I'm not going to lecture for 2 hours. In fact, this is unusual that I've even talked for 20 minutes in a row in any one situation. I'm used to everything being a conversation. So sorry if I run out of breath once or twice. But the idea is that unless you find a way to keep people interested when they get past a certain hump, you've got to, I don't know, feed them some kind of sugar. Hopefully it's more nutritional than that. But if you have change of pace within a classroom, okay, what are we doing after it is that I give this introduction on today's topic? Well, you have a problem set, and now I've got whiteboards around the room. You have stood up from your seat, and you've gone to the board, and you have problems in hand, and you have a classmate next to you, and you're working, right? And then there's a time when everybody sits down and we discuss the harder solutions. But even in the middle of that, I'm looking around the room and I can see what everybody's doing simultaneously, so I know what it is. When I see one person hit something that should be a discussion, either for them one-on-one or for the entire group, if I feel like I need to highlight it for everyone. And so, a class of 12 students, it becomes almost like a one-on-one experience. And that's where you get much, much higher attention levels. And like I said, almost zero, discipline problems, almost zero distraction. And if you think about 4 distracting students in a room, which was not uncommon for many of us in middle and high school, if you compound that, and these effects do stack, you're talking about a 30% reduction in all the learning in the classroom. 30% reduction. We're talking something on the order of a standard deviation, maybe a little bit more. So we're going to capture more standard deviations. I think we can go 3 to 4 out at least. But Yerkes-Dodson law, if you have people moving around the room, perhaps design the entire process. Students would say in one of my 2-hour classes, they would say, this is more math than I learned in school in 2 weeks or in a month or something like that. And I think that being able to have that contiguous 2 hours was an advantage in terms of telling the story and immediately having a feedback loop, and perhaps even having like a 10-minute down period during class where they can recover a little bit of energy. So next thing I want to bring up is, I talked about capturing more standard deviations. Oh, let's see. Sorry, I've got some pieces of other classes up here. Gonna find where I stocked my diagrams. Oh, here we go. So in 1984, a researcher named Benjamin Bloom decided that he wanted to test certain models of teaching versus each other. And he tested 3 models, which were the conventional classroom. Another was mastery learning, where you have a teacher who's good enough at doing what they do that they create a feedback process where the students do some work after a lesson, and then from the work, then what conversation to have with them afterward. But it's still one teacher with 30 students. And then tutorial education. And this is one-on-one, but I believe in the actual study, it was like one-on-one up to 1-on-3. And I have some suspicions as to why you still get this effect. But what he found was a full 2 sigma, this is sometimes called the 2 sigma problem, but a full 2 standard deviation improvement in all of the students in a class when they got one-on-one tutorial education. And so it turns out that, like this movement, this is equivalent to making the average student in class like a borderline genius. Maybe not quite that much. 3 standard deviations, I think, is what we call the genius line. But I think that with these other effects that I've talked about, we could stack them. We can. And I think, my evidence from my own classrooms tells me that we've done that at times. I think that some of my students who've gotten into MIT were not much different than, an average student in class, but they got interested and then they worked hard. And then I want to mention another piece, which is really one that takes me outside of the class. Well, actually mentioning this one-on-one right here, I think that I was able to actually do this in my classrooms the way that I built them with 1-on-12. I think I got very close to all the important conversations after the storytelling to being one-on-one, such that, I think the students, every question that they had, the things that really needed to be a feedback cycle, and those are where you get that feedback loop. I think I was able to keep the feedback cycle almost perfect for 2 hours. But then the next thing I want to talk about is the Suzuki method. And this is another place where I really disagree with the entire philosophy of schooling education that we have jumped into, which is that it really takes the parent almost entirely out of the process. And I don't know how many of you are parents or how much time you spend with your children, but I think there are a certain number of parents that, once the child's 5 years old, they just, hand them off to, to the school system. And I think that this is, it's a terrible, I think some people cope with it well, and some people still spend a lot of time with their children as educators. But I think that there's so much time taken away from that process. And if, for those of you who have heard of it, the Suzuki method or haven't, the Suzuki method is for violin teaching. There was a Japanese master of the violin. I think he went and studied in Germany and came back, and something that he saw at some point was that there was a parent-child relationship where children gravitated toward the values of their parents. And I think that once you hear just that phrase alone, the values of their parents are transmitted. They're transmitted vertically. I think that's much better than the horizontal transmission of values that we get in a classroom with students sort of raising and teaching each other to too great of a degree. Peer education is great. We should probably have kids in mixed age classrooms much more often. Mixed age groups. I don't even want to say classroom, but mixed age mentoring and groups much more often than we do. But we should have much more going on within the family, and we should free up more of our time for that. And I think that there we get much better one-on-one tutorial education anyway with a parent and a child, and it's much better motivated. But in the Suzuki method, you have the child, you have the parent take a class from the violin master. And while the parent is studying, the child gravitates toward it, reaching for the instrument, reaching for the bow. And now I want to do, this bow work that mommy is doing, or whatever it might be, or dad. And so that, we have a gradual transmission of values such that, we have already students moving toward, whatever it is that they might, that the parent might also be interested in. And, over time, maybe they reject some of that and they decide to pick up different activities, but at the very least, there is better guidance. So let's talk about some things that we're doing wrong. So we discourage parental involvement. And how do we create our system? We create it from a top-down approach within a political system. And I'm not sure it is what we would expect from that, but I think what we would expect are political outcomes. And who drives political outcomes? Well, in this day and age, it's mostly baby boomers. But originally, our system, which was passed to us from the Prussians, or rather, we went out to, American researchers went to Prussia, several different waves at different times, but went to Prussia to study their educational system. And they had a system there that was, very well designed for creating, one, obedience, and two, workers that they could put into factories. And that's really, what we've modeled our education from since. And I think that we've discovered so much that we could have a much more creative and much more energetic populace if we began to dismantle that now and began to create something like a network of mentors and a much better curriculum. So, aside from that, I want to give one more warning about artificial intelligence. I think that there's going to be good gaming within artificial intelligence, so long as we don't do it too much. I think that there's going to be good, problem selection, so long as we don't do it too much. So long as we don't do, we shouldn't be doing too much that's rote anyway. If you have a hard time with something, it may be that the next meta lesson is actually what connects you to the mathematics. And that happened for a lot of us at different points in time in our own education. So a lot of people, can relate to that. But, we're, within that, even the artificial intelligence, intelligence experts, they'll sometimes say, hey, I have this result where I've moved education 0.4 standard deviations. I actually have a friend who is involved in artificial education research, and we talked on the phone. He was excited one day about having gone through and learned about, the different amounts that we could move the curve. And I just want to warn against that. I think that we are giving up primary variables of human organization and human relationship and we're passing that off to technology, which I think is the second order set of variables. So I think that we need to focus on, frankly, creating an environment where humans are learning to love each other, first and foremost, that the interaction that we're involved in. And you get more of that in the family anyway. So I've become over time a pretty big homeschool proponent, even though I know that there are going to be, substantial speed bumps, substantial hurdles to get over within that. But I think that that if we want to actually, get away from what I think is a local suboptimum, if we want to get back to a point where we can dramatically improve education, we probably want to look to the family units. And that's where we're going to, recreate a love of human communication and storytelling, which is really more than anything in the heart of mathematics education. And with that, I'm open to questions.
Great.
Just on the last thing you said. Oh, sorry.
No. Please.
I just had a quick question. I mean, what about students who don't have cohesive family units?
Right. That's a good question. And I'll mention a story. Last year, I nearly went to work with a charter school. In fact, I moved between states because I thought that I was going to go help build a math team at a charter school in order to, just kind of create an exciting environment. And that was going to be like a quarter of my work week. And just to see what we could do. And just to give you an idea, this was a charter school in Chattanooga, and it's the poorest of the poor kids. And there was already a magnet school in this downtown area for girls called like Girls Leadership Academy that seemed to be doing pretty well, but there wasn't one for the boys. So somebody created a boys, like a prep school starting with 6th graders, and they're adding a new grade each year. And I looked through a lot of the KIPP research. The charter schools that have been most successful have mostly been within these large networks where they've been able to fine tune processes and train people. And like the KIPP research showed, I think it was 1.2 standard deviations of improvement among the students at the 5th through 8th grade level. It was equivalent to an 18-point IQ shift on an effective level. And I'll go ahead and mention, I have done IQ research in the past. And one of the things that I grew to believe about IQ is that it's much less static than we thought. It's just that we find so few ways to move it more than a little. But from the average student going into a KIPP school had like a 91 effective IQ according to standardized tests. And when they were done at the end of the 8th grade, it was 109. It was exactly the opposite. Actually, I think I've got that wrong. I think it was actually 94 to 112 or something like that. But anyway, it was 18 points, 1.2 standard deviation. So, I saw that. And this is actually where I discovered the distraction research was, I looked into why is it that KIPP is able to do this. And I think that most of all, they got, troubled students into an environment which was higher discipline. And I think that higher discipline, like in general, I don't usually prefer high discipline X for most values of X. But I think that when you have, troubled home life situations, to get students from a certain age to a certain age where they have covered the basics, they are, credible readers, writers, and, solid foundation with mathematics, that's probably a good thing for a certain proportion of the population. And that can be organized in a number of ways. I'm still not a fan of, the top-down compulsory system, but to the extent that we could dismantle it, we're going to have to eat that elephant one spoonful at a time. And so that would be the last piece of the elephant I would want to eat, which is what it is that we do, so long as we're doing it in an effective way for those students who are least likely to have a cohesive family unit. So hopefully they can provide that for their own family at the next level.
Matthew, I wanted to chime in. This is Danielle. Thank you so much for speaking tonight. I read a book last year called Peak, which is about the effect of deliberate practice in a field. And it's really all about, it's sort of like a nature versus nurture kind of book. And one of the chapters that I loved in the book at the end, actually, was all about mastery of chess. And they talked about that you would think that the kids who were best at chess at the beginning and like the highest IQ kids would also be the ones who were outperforming later on as well. But what they found was that it was the second tier kids who ended up doing a lot of deliberate practice and just really honing their craft who would become the masters later on. But you needed to delay sort of boxing them into like, oh, they're the second tier kids instead of the first tier. And what the point they tried to make at the end was you know, especially in mathematics education, we tend to put like the quote unquote smart kids in a box and say, okay, these are the ones who are going to get, you know, the gifted and talented, the special stuff, and the second tier and below don't get this. And they were sort of making this point of, you know, it's sort of a shame that we box students in so early, and it would be better if we could kind of delay that process a lot. And so I'm sort of curious what you think about, I mean, you've already mentioned homeschooling, which, you know, like I'm a huge proponent of, but I'm curious about for those kids who are going into like group clusters and things like that, are there any sort of recommendations that you have to keep them from getting boxed into like, oh, this student is standard versus an honor student and so on, especially at the earliest levels?
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and mention, I just threw up an article that Andrew Breeze sent me a couple of weeks ago that kind of makes a similar point to what you're making, which is that it's the kids who are actually doing things on their own, like reading books and learning about the history of chess. You know, the ones who knew the history of chess were the ones who, you know, had actually taken the interest unto themselves. And, you know, I think that it's perfectly fine to, like, you know, throw 9 and 10-year-olds in front of a chessboard. In fact, I think that's great, even if not all of them will continue to study it 5 years down the road, right? You know, people are going to they're going to test things out, they're going to find their interests. But it's absolutely true that the ones who internalize an interest are going to be the ones who, you know, do more long-term in terms of that mastery. As far as tracking goes, though, that's a little bit tough. I think that what happens is we track in schools, and there are good and bad consequences of that, right? You know, I think around 6th grade, suddenly math team was opened up for me, and that was such a relief because, you know, math classes were so, I would basically spend math class teaching the other students for 45 minutes a day, every single day. That was what I did for math, you know, the entirety of elementary school, you know, up to the point that I had a math team class. And then at least, like, we had, like, you know, problem packets. And even if sometimes the topic wasn't interesting to me or I had already mastered it, I could look at these problems from, you know, national exams, things called like the AMC exams, or, you know, math counts, or, you know, math counts is the big middle school math competition. And I would just sit and work on problems on my own. And so I had something to do, right? So, you know, first there's giving students something to do. And I think at its best, tracking does that. At its best, it puts kids in a classroom with other people who aren't distracting either. But I do think that there is a big consequence in students developing an interest and learning what it means to develop an interest. And if you have students, you know, just like you know, the girls mixing with the boys in a classroom, right? If you have the boys break away, suddenly the remaining boys are distracting each other even more. Not that girls never distract, but the boys are the primary culprits. And if you have this in a regular classroom too, if you break away the students who already have an interest, who are going to distract less in that classroom, if you break them off from the rest of the group, you are clustering the students more who are more distracting. I think that that's a big piece of it. But even aside from that, one of the things that we need to stop doing is telling people you're a math person, you know, or you're not a math person, or you're an English person, a verbal person, or this or that. I actually think that, you know, the biggest thing within my career that separated me from, and it was a lot of the reason I did not seek a PhD in mathematics after college, was I recognized that there was a much bigger problem to solve on a communication level. And so, you know, when I got to college, I actually focused more time on the debate team than I did on, you know, taking the Putnam exam and trying to, you know, get a higher score for myself on the Putnam for, you know, whatever that would be worth when I applied to graduate school. I think that we need to be very accepting and make it very clear that we're accepting of different people developing different interests all throughout life. You know, there are examples of people who became great mathematicians or scientists or writers or anything else when they were 40 or 50 years old. And, you know, I think that we kind of bake a certain, you know, I call it the best slave pageant for all kinds of reasons. But I think that we bake a certain level of narcissism into that by telling people you're good at this early on. And I think it actually winds up in the end crippling some of the ones who are tracked high. And in other ways, it winds up crippling some of the ones who are not tracked high. So, you know, as we break apart the educational system, I think this is one of those problems that will disintegrate, and it'll, you know, as we reform community into a smoother thing, period. So hopefully we'll solve that through what I consider to be the network as opposed to the classroom model.
Matthew, we have a question from Abby.
Hi, Matthew. So quick question.
Yeah.
Let's say I want to rebuild my math skills from scratch. Where do I start? Like you mentioned having that conversation with someone.
Mm-hmm.
Where would I go to have that conversation?
Right. And I think the answer is tougher the older you are, but I don't want to say, if you can find a mentor to work with. I think that, interestingly, we have, and some of that may depend on how much you're willing to spend. I think that, adult coaching is something that we're sort of, gradually understanding as a market. It's a way bigger market than people think. There's like a $30 billion a year worldwide market in mentoring, and not all of that is mentoring kids. Even more of it's at the college level. But, some of what I do actually, I've had a number of CEOs or executives or professors at different times come to me and ask for a certain amount of time of teaching. And so, and it's different in every case, right? You can probably, ask through a network, do you know anybody who can teach me X? And, it depends on what you're interested in. Most often, if it's an adult, I have people ask me about, learning discrete math, because almost anybody who didn't go through mathematics to the point of getting a good statistics education probably doesn't know that it starts back in the stuff that they did on a superficial level in pre-algebra that we just called permutations and combinations. Correct for overcounting or don't correct for overcounting. Okay, what does that mean? And you get sort of no additional I guess maybe in algebra 2 you do the binomial expansion theorem, but you need to find a professional who can just talk with you for a few minutes and identify what it would be that would be correct for you in terms of rebuilding your foundation. Aside from that, I'm actually I don't actually know what I'm doing next as a career. I'm kind of meandering right now, trying to do some things that work, and I'm working with adults more. I developed a math club for adults, and I'm going to start to create videos, and the videos can be for adults or children, but I do want to work on piggybacking a network off of that. And so I'm actually kind of in the hunt for a technologist partner who can help create actually the network that I want to create of mentors. And this would include mentors who could work with adults and help them on a professional base. Sometimes I see people do things like go to what's the coding academy?
Code Academy?
No, Allred.
Lambda School.
Lambda School. Thank you.
Yes.
Like my bet is that before going to Lambda School, there are a lot of people who would get a whole lot out of 5 to 10 weeks of work with a mentor on discrete math. A little bit of theory, a substantial amount of combinatorics, and that would set up people to learn programming excellently.
Yeah, I'd be happy to chat if you're interested on the technology front.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can talk.
Yeah, cool.
Somebody asked about Kumon, and I'm going to go ahead and mention I think that Kumon is a very mixed bag. I think that when there was nothing else, it was a way for a parent to tell their child, I value this, and so I want you to learn this. And so, you may go to this class, but at the very least, you're going to work this set of problems so that you get this stuff at a mastery level. And so I think that it was sort of a rudimentary attempt to create a mastery level that is very suboptimal and sometimes pretty boring. And I've seen a lot of kids just kind of get angry with it and reject it. And even when I interviewed students for my classes, sometimes I would see their anger, coming from the past programs that their parents had brought them into, and then their relief after talking with me for, the hour interview that I put them through. I think there are a lot of things that are mixed bags, and that's one of them.
I had a question relating to the title of this talk, actually. It reminded me of that one episode where Wesley was in school and he had an iPad in front of him and it was talking to him, right? He was talking back. And you mentioned that you don't think that that's going to happen soon, but I'm wondering why, because I'm a machine learning AI person, not to box myself in, but you could put that in with a GPT-2 and text-to-speech type algorithm and probably get it done in a rudimentary way today. But I don't know. I'm assuming there are probably pitfalls to that I'm not seeing.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and tell you, there's nothing that you just said that I hadn't heard 20 years ago. And people who would come to me, especially when I was working on art of problem solving, and people would constantly come to me with all these different ideas. And, I've seen almost no advancement. I've seen, people create problem-serving machines. And I'll go, I created one myself, and there's one at Art of Problem Solving. People would create these problem-learning machines, but what nobody came anywhere close to that I've seen is the ability to listen to somebody and then pick out a story to tell. And I'm not sure that we would even want to, because I'm not sure that we want to begin breaking those connections between human beings. I think that there's so many risks involved that I think that we should probably stop telling these stories as if it's on the horizon, one. It's fine to talk about it as a conjecture, but I've heard the conjecture for more than 20 years. I think that we should, at the very least, get back to people learning how to teach people more. And I'll just go ahead and mention, we've talked about standard deviations of movements. I would run like a 30-hour summer program and teach students geometry, and we'd wind up doing, they'd probably get more out of it than people would say, this is more than I learned in my math class, entirely from last year, like 30 hours versus 165 hours. And when you think about, how many, standard deviations of movement are we talking about, we can already achieve 3, 4, 5, I think, standard deviations. Whereas, the machine learning people, they come up with like, hey, if we do this, it's 0.4, and that's a big movement. And then there's 0.2, and then there's 0.15. And we stack these things together and we're doing great. But even when Khan Academy developed their SAT program, right? They developed, hey, everybody can get online and do SAT prep, and it's free for everybody. And what they found was an even bigger separation between the top students and everybody else. Why? Because those top students were already interested, right? They had already had whatever that human connection was, whether it came from a parent or whatever. It was the self-motivated people who got online, who were already the top students, who then got the biggest boost out of the, actually, I think it was, if an average student took it, they got a slightly larger boost. But almost none of those students actually stuck with it or even went to go do it. It was all the students who were at the top who went to Khan Academy to go do it. And so I don't know, I think there are all kinds of pitfalls in investing in that direction, but even then we have not seen the results. We definitely haven't seen, the design of the storytelling. Even top-notch mathematicians, many of them, they've never studied communication. They wouldn't know what to do to lay out a curriculum document like this, much less, connected to how a classroom is going to be run. And so I just think, all the evidence is on the table. We can move the curve a lot already. And if we're already hitting that human side, we're already making cyborgs anyway, as far as I'm concerned. So the question is, do we have cyborgs? Why focus on math education?
Okay.
Matthew, we have a question from Max that came in a while ago, and he can't ask it due to his microphone. He says he's mentoring people in Harvard CS50. How do I reach more of the STEM high school students?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and say this. Because Art of Problem Solving was so successful, there's a whole lot of eyeball draw toward that platform and then toward the network within that platform. And so, one thing I've seen is I've had a number of, especially foreign students who come to the United States and study mathematics at university say, how do I find students to tutor? That was actually what I was hoping to make a living doing. I guess you can put up flyers, you can go on Craigslist and put out advertisements, but it is harder at the point at which we have networks begin to draw the attention and vet for better teachers and even teach better teaching within the network. So, to some degree, I think you just have to work on your community. You have to work on the connections you have. Maybe go teach at a summer program. Some of those are decent pay anyway, especially if you're in college, but go teach at a summer program. And if you do a good job, work on it really hard. Like I said, I might spend 16 hours on my average 2-hour class. If you prepare really hard for it and your students know that they've gotten an elevated experience, then suddenly that investment turns into attention that comes back to you.
Great, we have a question from Mike.
Okay, hello. Yes, okay, was a big part of your purpose here to convince us that math teachers would not be replaced by artificial intelligences?
You know, like I said, I had a hard time choosing the topic of the talk. You know, like whether or not that happens, I really, in some sense, I don't care. I mean, I do care in this sense. Like I do worry about the future in which we move more and more towards cyborgs and what existential threats there are in that timeline. Yeah, I listen to artificial intelligence experts like oh gosh, I can't remember his name. French researcher. Never mind. There was a podcast on Joe Rogan, if any of you have ever watched it, and it's like Sam Harris talking with a guy, an artificial intelligence expert, and the artificial intelligence expert doesn't seem to be all that worried about existential threats. But then as Sam asks him questions, he's like, well, yeah, if it goes about that way, then it probably will destroy humanity. What if it happens this way? Well, then it'll probably destroy humanity. What about this branch? Well, then it'll probably destroy humanity. But I think that after all these branches, we're actually going to be here, and there's a chance that we survive, right? Okay. And when I look at that, I think the people who are in charge of artificial intelligence, whoever those 10,000 people are who are really at the bleeding edge, and I've had, and a lot of those people were former students of mine. I have a lot of former students who are, you know, at Google Brain or places like that. But what I see is an unfortunately large number of those people are either autistic or manipulatable personalities, and that worries me. I'm just going to go ahead and say that directly. All right. That worries me a lot. I actually think that we have a very small number of people involved in that process who are actually worried to think a lot about that process. And I think that we should probably do what we can to slow down, even aside from the fact that, in my opinion, the evidence says the humans can already make dramatic leaps, so much farther than we even think the AI can do, at least presently. I think it'll be.
It would never have occurred to me that anybody might think that AI would contribute much of anything. It would, you know, you're trying to convince me that something is not true that I would never have suspected anybody would think was true.
Okay. I'll say this as an educator: many people have come to me to try to rope me into AI projects, and so, you know, that, and I've had many conversations about it with many people.
AI projects for math teaching?
Yeah, the number of people who are in graduate school right now doing projects for specifically math education is enormous, you know, in the thousands.
Okay.
It is a hot field. It is a hot topic.
I mean, okay, I can see AI somehow being used to teach people math skills. One of the big mistakes is to think that you can learn math by learning skills.
Well, I think Rajul, just judging from his demeanor, I think he has the opposite bias. I think that he thinks we're closer to that than I might think. You know, judging by the way he's asking his questions, you think that it's almost absurd. We have a pretty, right now within our population, within, you know, I would say smart people in general, I think we have a pretty wide array. I think we have a pretty flat distribution, actually, in terms of how close people think we are. So I personally think that things that are artistic, and I argue that mathematics is way more of that than we give it credit for, because we wind up with so many of these people who spend so much time detached studying the Penrose world that they don't come back to communicate and report quite so well as they could. And so we misunderstand the entire process. And I think even, you know, the AI researchers, I don't think that they will know how far away they are from the process for a very long time. That's my opinion.
All right. Okay.
And of course, you know, many of these opinions are lightly held and they change as I, you know, have different conversations and learn, you know, with people. But anyhow, how do you convince parents to be better parents? Wow. I think, how do you convince people to be better people? And I think that, you know, one of the biggest ways to do that is by example, and to create a program. You know, if you create something and it succeeds and you explain to people how it succeeds, and I think that latter part too is something that we don't do enough. We don't do enough of explaining to people, this is what just went right. But in general, you know, education is mostly a monopoly. And so we're really not even allowed to get close to that question. And the farther we keep parents from students, the less it is that we can teach parents anything about being better parents. And I think that we are baking bits of narcissism into the process, one generation at a time, such that parents probably have to go through the entire process of a certain amount of failure before they even know what went wrong. But I think we have to put students, children back with the parents more in order to get that, feedback loop moving in the right direction.
Matthew, I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just curious, why did you decide to provide your materials in LaTeX? As a student myself, when I see LaTeX, it traumatized me because it reminds me of all the problem sets I did. But you said you spent a lot of time, compiling these things. It's hard to type it up, but your approach is also a very story-based, not as formal as a typical usual math class. So I was just wondering, why do you prepare these kind of formalized documents for a story-based class?
I don't even know how I would write up a document like this, without LaTeX. There's some point at which, the building, the nice typesetting, it's set up for you. I mean, there's a learning curve and everything, but it's set up for you. And I'll go ahead and mention, I've written 20,000 pages of curriculum. When I look at this, I've even changed the way over time that I wrote things. A lot of people will leave no space between in and the equal sign. And I'll tell you, when you've debugged 20,000 pages of curriculum, you begin to say, hey, how should I be typing in the best possible way? It's kind of like, I don't know if you're a coder or not, but I assume that anybody who works a whole lot in one language, wants to get to a point where they can just type fluidly. And having used LaTeX, I've never even seen anything where I would imagine myself just being able to fluidly, bang, 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 paragraphs and equations. And it took a while to get here, so I'm probably not going anywhere anytime soon, but I think it's fantastic. And it has stood the test of time for decades now. I don't know when Knuth made that. Was it like 60s, maybe? Over 50 years. And this is one of those places, kind of like human to human teaching, where I would think, don't touch what works.
Hi, Matthew.
I don't know if I answered that question well or not, but yeah, Brendan.
Yeah, I want to jump in with a question about the future stuff, and maybe not so much just conjecture, but maybe try to drive more to like the values or the philosophy of it. I noted in the comments earlier, like prominent futurists like Ray Kurzweil or Nick Bostrom predict something like a technological singularity or an explosion of superintelligence within the coming century. And so my then values-based question is if we can anticipate like an explosion of superintelligence relatively soon, then what is the value of mathematics education in the present day as a society? Right. Or maybe there's another way to approach the question, which is how do we do the kind of the probability weighting? Like if we weigh it as like a certain probability that superintelligence will render any human research useless, like how do we decide what is the best course to take today? How do we value that?
Yeah, I'm going to begin by challenging the very underpinnings of this singularity idea. And I like the singularity idea. I think it's a good exploration. It's a good thought experiment. But I think that that it winds up being taken religiously and without enough discussion of what are the roots. Why is this curve this curve? Why is it that transistors or processor speed would increase at an exponential rate? And I think that most of the people who are in silicon technology get this wrong, because I think that we get wrong very often the idea of what technology even is. So I'm actually going to go a step back and say that what people should do is study economics more. There's something, I guess a few decades ago, growth models were kind of the holy grail of economics. And there was a guy, Robert Solow, MIT economist, who came up with the first big aggregate growth model. And in the aggregate growth model, there were basically three inputs, really just two, which I'll call capital. And he divided this into, labor and, materials capital. And then there was everything else was just called technology, right? And the capital was the stuff that it scaled the output linearly. And so implicitly, we called anything which created that exponential feedback loop, we called that technology. And so while people tend to think of computers as technology, that's fundamentally wrong. When we go back in time, the big technologies that moved humanity were, law. Go back to Hammurabi, the way that we constructed religions to be part of civilization, the way that we constructed our social cultures, our networks. I think that even, it's funny, this is the 1517 fund. I would say that the Reformation was a fundamental upgrade of software, and it allowed, once the boats had been made, you had the boats in China, but they got burned in 1430. Then you have, the Dutch trading empire. We had Portugal getting around Cape Horn and going and trading with India. And then you have, the Dutch trading fleet, and eventually the English and whatnot. Boating technology was really what helped establish corporate technology. The Dutch East Indies Company, and then the British East Indies Company. And there were several other East Indies companies throughout Europe. So we should fundamentally go back and go, what is technology? And anything that results in, exponential aggregate output is technology. Now, we look back and we study and we see these technological curves growing since the 1400s. But what we don't have enough data to see clearly is whether or not the exponent is changing. And the Moore's law curve assumes an unchanging exponent. And I'll tell you what I think has actually happened. I think that from a few decades ago until I bet we're approaching the end of it pretty soon, that it was always worth it on a dollar cost level, on a dollar invested level. It was always worth the next increment, the next increment, the next increment. In other words, you have a curve where the derivative is the same as the curve, which is the exponential curve. That's e to the x. And so I think that what we have is an unchanging exponent for a little while. But I think what's going to happen is we're going to get a slightly damper exponent as time goes on. And that we're going to diverge from, what we think of as the singularity curve. We're going to diverge from it gradually. It's still going to go up. We're always still going to have things to invest $1 in that will produce more than $1 on, depending on our time preference, somewhere out there on the horizon. I think that that we're just going to see the curve, the exponent itself gradually dampen. And so we're going to have a longer and longer and longer wait period to make it to heaven or whatever you want to call it. And that might even be like an infinite time horizon. It might even be like thinking in terms of Zeno's paradox. Is Zeno's paradox the one where you cut a distance in half?
Yeah.
Somebody shoots an arrow toward you. Is it ever going to make it to you? Well, it has to make it halfway, and it has to do that infinitely many times, except that you're chopping up the actual time intervals. But what if the time intervals stayed the same and you had half as much progress at the next level? Then, maybe it is, somebody said S curve, and it may be that we S curve on a level of technology. And I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know what the future of all investment looks like, but at the very least, we need to think about this model. And I think we have too much conversation about achieving the singularity without looking at the underpinnings of this model. And it happens on an economic level. I think anybody in technology should be studying economics more to really get, I think both a moral grip on technology, but also, to decide what is or isn't just like a promoted religion. And I think that singularity kind of became a promoted religion.
Yeah, for sure. It's good that you're thinking about Moore's law, because certainly like a lot of technologists are talking about the end of Moore's law and kind of acknowledging the same things that you pointed out, that, single CPUs are approaching almost like physical limits of like, transistors physically cannot get any smaller than a few atoms or things like that.
And then we have the graphene people saying, hey, we're going to be able to run graphene processors at speeds that would turn silicon into puddles. And then we've got quantum computing as another possibility after that. So maybe we do bridge that gap. And I don't, for all I know, maybe the exponent will stay the same.
For sure. That's why I guess my one counterpoint to what you said, because I actually agree with you that Moore's law, the particular relationship that Moore's law describes, we're approaching the limits of, but there are other sources of exponential growth in technology and computing power that are being explored much more heavily now, that businesses cannot just rely on, processors getting faster, doubling every 18 months or whatever it is. So there's a lot more academic and industry research in how do we continue this exponential growth. in other ways besides the particular relationship that Moore's law describes. So
yeah, actually, my entire approach to education actually starts here. I actually think that that if there is such thing as the great stagnation, like Tyler Cohen writes about, that it may be that that what we've done, and this is really a game theory conversation, which is that we've spent too much time investing people in asymmetric technologies. We definitely do that in finance with all the hedge fund, technology that we've developed and the way investments have gone, public investments. More and more of the cream is happening within smaller and smaller pools. And warfare is asymmetric technology, right? We've overinvested in asymmetric technologies. Maybe that was bound to happen. I don't know. Maybe that was bound to happen. But if we're going to change a paradigm, then changing at the education level is the thing that would give us so many more things that we could then invest in down the road. And I think that a lot of things that we don't even understand as technology. I think every human being who runs a business, if you have a profitable business, you are employing technology, and a lot of times we don't even put words to all the things that we do. And so I think that we'll see an explosion of people able to run themselves, their life as their own business, if we change the educational system. So I kind of connect these questions together, and I don't worry too much about the singularity. I don't worry too much about Moore's law, except that I worry that if we go after artificial intelligence too quickly, in some sense, that we exacerbate existential risks, which may not even need to be there, except if we do it unwisely.
Awesome. Very interesting. Thank you for your thoughts.
Are there any other questions? Oh, somebody says, how do you connect math preparation and data analytics? That's a good question. I sort of feel like some of my early career was kind of data analytics. And I almost went to work for the St. Louis Cardinals to do baseball analytics in the 90s before I got the Wall Street offer that took me to D.E. Shaw. I think really, problem solving, I think, well, first of all, teach more discrete math. Start with the combinatorics, and people should be thinking more in statistics early on. I think that we do ourselves a huge disservice downgrading statistics within our educational system. And I know that's changed a little, but not nearly enough, and not teaching any game theory at all. I would say that if there are two most important branches of mathematics to humans, it would be statistics and game theory, maybe after your basic finance, just learning how dollars work. But statistics might be 70%, and then game theory 30%. And that's how we'll add value to the world broadly. So I would say, much more combinatorics early on. And with it, if you know combinatorics fairly well, the idea of a distribution and, all the basic notions and statistics that you need to soak up, both with the symbol dancing game and also on the intuitive level. There's plenty of that 10-year-olds can start to work with. All right, somebody writes, what does the future of education look like for you, given what you've learned about effective teaching and knowing the flaws of the current educational system? I'm actually in the process of figuring out my next project. It's funny, just today I learned about Loom, and I'm thinking about different things that I've got to do, and I may create a Patreon channel and begin to release my, like I said, I've got thousands of pages of curriculum, and I may put videos with them and start releasing them and seeing if that creates a model. But I've also explored the model of creating a network, but for that I would need a technologist, one that I couldn't pay immediately, unfortunately. Or maybe that'll depend on what Bitcoin does, we'll see. You mentioned earlier that time matters when it comes to learning math. Why is it harder when one gets older? Isn't abstract thinking something you can do better when you get older? So I think harder, it gets both harder and easier, but in different ways. I think that it gets easier, like we know how to learn better as adults. There are things that I sat down and didn't learn right away for some reason at some point in time, that now at the age of 42, I go to a web page or I open a book, and suddenly, just the idea, I absorb it easily. And I don't know all of what happens, except that I know that along the way, because I've struggled with different a broader set of concepts along the way, there was something within that struggle that made it easier for me to suddenly read about, certain ideas in physics, for instance, that were harder for me to read about. And I didn't, I only took like 5 classes in physics ever, so I didn't do the deep physics. But when I see it, it's easier for me to do a lot of things at different levels. I don't know, just everything I've explored. On the other hand, I find that I spend less and less of my time doing specific learning projects as I get older, if they're not related to something I'm doing for work. And maybe that's simply that I'm within that age range that's sort of a high productivity age range, and my own projects are I don't know, you're always trading off between learning something new in your own project. So I don't know, I go through bands where I don't even pick up a new book for weeks at a time, and or I don't learn anything on a deep level for months at a time. Just because I don't know, I think when we get more productive, when we get more busy, if you have kids, you're paying more attention to your kids. But I do think it gets easier for a while because we do, we've had more experiences.
Great. On that note, Matthew, thank you so much for this engaging discussion this evening.
Thanks for having me.
I see you left your email address in the chat, crawford.matthew@gmail.com.
Just for anybody, just to make sure, I only have one T in my first name. So if you don't copy paste that email, you might miss that part.
Is there anywhere else that people can find you?
Yeah, I have a website that, and you can almost ignore everything that's there right now, but I have a new company, metaprep.net. And I've only done a couple of projects there so far, but I'm going to use it as a platform for upcoming projects, some of which I know and some of which I don't yet, but metaprep.net.
Perfect. Well, Matthew, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in this evening. And we'll be in touch with a recording of this evening's conversation if you are looking forward to that. I know a number of people have asked about that. So have a good evening, everyone. Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks, Zach.